Okay, welcome everybody. I'm super excited for today's Ask Me Anything. I'm Laura Ann Edwards, and this is the sixth session of the Art and Science of Systems Thinking, a series of incubators I've had the extreme honor to host here on Polyplexus. And I've really been particularly looking forward to this Ask Me Anything session with Thomas Debass, from the U.S. State Department, or do you say Department of State or State Department? I think we vernacularly say, yeah, okay. He's the Managing Director and Chief Partnerships Officer. And so I wanted to talk to Thomas today about global partnerships, which he has a unique perspective on, and diplomacy, which he certainly is in the center of at least an organization that is built for it, is all about diplomacy. I wanted to look at those topics from a systems lens. So welcome, Thomas. And just to start, when we say global partnerships, and specifically your role or the perspective of your department, how is that different from any other, like just sort of the common sense idea of partnerships?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. First, thank you for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, just having always these mind-expanding conversations with you. So it's an honor for me to be here. And second, obviously, I'm here on my own personal capacity, and I have obviously the pleasure and an honor working at the U.S. Department of State, working with partnerships. But I would love this conversation to be much more on my own personal views, not necessarily the views of the department or the views of the Debass family, for that matter. It's just me, Tomas. So yeah, and from a mandate, from a partnership perspective, obviously, the merit of the mandate itself is a systems thinking view, because we have now recognized that global issues or challenges that we face around the world are no longer the burden of a single country, a single government, or a single organization, or a single society. And it's very expansive, and it's very complicated, and it's in some cases, especially the big issues, the climate, the pandemic itself, are systemic level of challenges that we're facing. So we recognize that then we need to address these issues in a collaborative way, because we all are intimately involved in these kind of things. And how do we then make sure that we're bringing the best minds, the best resources, the best networks, and the best way of thinking to solving these problems? So I work in that nexus of recruiting, finding, and kind of listening the pulses of where things are going. And then how do you then bring folks that are unlikely to work together, to bring them together to address specific foreign policy issues, development issues, or any challenges that we face? So that's the lens we come at it from a global partnerships perspective, is that we are kind of the door, the window to the department when it comes to private sector engagement. And especially in these days, the role of the private sector has been expanded very dramatically, not just from a financial perspective, not just from an economic might perspective, but from ideas perspective, from leverage perspective, from a reach perspective, from depth perspective, that are, at least from a U.S. perspective, the U.S. private sector role and influence is ever expanding. And we want to make sure that we can collaborate with them. So then our approach doesn't just become a U.S. government approach, it becomes an all hands on deck, an all American approach, especially when we have a very diverse fabric of society and tools. Why not deploy them to solve these global challenges that we face? So that's the approach that we come from my office's perspective.
So I know, and we'll get more down the rabbit hole of systems tools. So I know you personally have the systems vocabulary and training from multiple certificates and backgrounds, and from economics and foresight and other things. And so we'll get into that. But within your role at the State Department, just not to not to give
Yeah.
away any secrets, but to understand the vocabulary within this sort of institution, right? And I realize it's a unique institution, but that said, do you and I've talked about this before, is it an inherent systems approach or is it an explicit systems approach? Are those words said out loud?
Yeah, I mean, it's inherent, I would say, because the challenges that we face and we address at the department level are complex and vast, right? From the deep ocean to the galaxies in that sense, right? So in that sense, it's systems thinking. But then when you're dealing with, obviously, that the department is a big organization that has, bureaus and offices and all those, but there are officers who then deal with their lane, right? They're
Right,
if they're
sure.
dealing with climate, they're dealing with climate. If they're dealing with labor issues, they're dealing with labor issues. So you're essentially looking at a broad systems thinking that gets applied, but you're also looking at it from your unit of analysis, right? If your officer's unit of analysis is X, you're viewing that systems thinking from X perspective, not from the bigger perspective. And that's essentially the build of a bureaucracy, right? This is not uniquely to the department. It's just even corporations deal with things like that, right? So there is a kind of a balancing act that happens where the issue that you're dealing with has intimate interconnection to the vast area of society and issues and all those things that happens, but you're still stuck with that unit that you're dealing with. And how do I then address my issues, despite the fact the complexity of the situation? How do I address it that way? So there is a balancing act that happened, but I wouldn't say it's an explicit way of thinking. I think it's every one of us who are trained to work at the Department of State do recognize the complexity of situations, but we still have a mandate to deal with the burning issue or the mandate, the specific mandate that we have.
So within your domain, what are some of the tools that you personally run your team with? Do you mind map? Do you what do you pull out of your bag of tricks?
Yeah, great question. So for us, we are a very agnostic office. I am not, I don't run an office that deals with specific issues, right? The department has amazing talent and depth on specific issues or specific regions that we have institutional knowledge with. So we rely on that knowledge base on those things. Our job from partnerships building perspective is to frankly connect these dots, these disparate dots that are everywhere, to say someone is saying about this specific issue this way, someone is saying it, and you're almost a conductor that
Sure.
you're hearing all these different tunes everywhere. And how do I then bring them together so they can sound with symphony of ideas that might come out of those, right? So the tools we use, we use design thinking and brainstorming and all those kind of things where it's a very user-centric type of mental state that we bring to the questions. What are the problem we're trying to solve? Why are we solving it? Why should somebody else care about this? Because if a problem that is in front of us, we don't build partnership for the sake of partnerships. It's not just singing kumbaya because we like to hear that. It's about, we have a specific challenge that we're facing around the world, and we need, and then we ask the question, who else cares about this? Is it just us we care about this? And if the answer is yes, then there is no other thing to do. Then we just go address it ourselves. But in almost the majority of the cases, there are other people or other organizations, other governments, other companies, other societies, everyone who cares about them. And then how do we then conduct that? How do we coordinate that? How do we, quarterback that in terms of bringing those things together? And in order to do that, then you have to have the empathy to understand where people are looking at why. If I care about water, why should another company care about that? And then if I understand where their business model, why they're affected by it, then I will have an interesting insight about what resources they could bring to the table. So the ability to not only be insightful, but to be able to almost decode what people are thinking about becomes a critical tool to do that. So we use kind of conventional methods, but in most cases, we're in the business of dot connecting and disparate dots that are out there. And because we have this unique convening authority or convening power that we have, and that becomes our superpower. Because when we say we want to hear from you, people tend to show up and to give us their insights, and then we take that and be able to kind of then start adding layers up to layers of these different information that we have, and hopefully out of that comes a set of solutions that we might be able to render. In most of the cases, the solutions are never from us; it's like from others, and our job is to kind of, coordinate those kind of things. So that's the approach we take.
So when you have used these tools within your team and you've looked at a region or issue and to see who are the players, who are the stakeholders, who's affected, even if they're not in any sort of agency, how do you present that within the organization for, adjustment, editing, other ideas? How do you take it out of your team and share that map, if you will, with the wider organization? Or does
Great question. I think great question. So let me kind of dissect that into two. I think from a partnership building perspective, the approach that we take are uniquely different, meaning we're focusing around who else cares about it, not necessarily what they will do.
Okay.
Right? Because what we're saying is who cares about this issue, and then our job is to kind of bring them in and evaluate what value do they bring to the table. Just because they care about it doesn't mean they could add value.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we understand the value that they add, then that's where we bring in the experts who are talking to us about the issue that they're trying to address. If it's women empowerment is the issue that we're trying to address, then we're not the women empowerment office. Then we bring in the folks who care about women empowerment, who knows about those things, to say, here are the 4 or 5 companies or organizations or civil society groups who are interested about this. And then we bring them together, and then a kind of a mind mesh happens out of that. And our job is to kind of observe the conversation. And hopefully out of that conversation, a certain collaboration happens, an intimacy happens that says, hey, we all think about these issues. I bring X, you bring Y, you bring Z. How about if we work together to address it? Then that's where our work begins, essentially creating the tissue, the binding bond that needs to happen between the department and all these different actors to make the transaction happen. When I say transaction, not necessarily financial, but the beauty of working together to address that problem. So that's kind of what we care about. What they will do, as I've mentioned, then that gets into the complexity of the situation where the experts, the bureau or the office, because we essentially have clients within the department that we support, because they whether it's a regional issue they're dealing with or a thematic issue that they're dealing with. So they're the one, we rely on their expertise to essentially go tit for tat with the experts, right? And our job is, as experts of partnership building, is to make sure that we're creating the enabling environment for that to foster. So because from a government perspective, working with the private sector is not as easy. You worry about ethical issues. Am I crossing the border in terms of ethics issues, or legal issues, PR issues, all the kind of risks that comes with that. So we are able to navigate the kind of the landmines of what it means to collaborate, right? Collaboration people make it look like it's an easy thing that just happens, because if we have chemistry, however organic that chemistry might be, it doesn't always work out that way, because you never understood, you might not, the complexities, if you're talking systems thinking, if you never understood the pulse of why an organization wants to work with you, what their motivations are, what drives them, what their things are, it's going to be difficult for us to address it. Because then problems might arise. Because if I'm getting into a partnership with an organization they might care about the issue, but why they care about it, that the way they approach might be something I cannot stomach, because it might be against my policy, it might be against my imperatives that I'm working with. So then I might have to pause on that work, because we have a value system issue, right? Because our values might not align, despite the drive that we might have in working together, but the values might not align. So partnership building as a practice itself is a systems thinking process. It's not as simple as that. You have $1, I have $1, or you have an idea, let's just mesh them together and something happens. is not as simplistic as that, because we all, the partners who bring it together, they bring their baggage, right? They bring their all the stuff that they come with, including ours. We have a lot of baggage. We're huge institutions with amazing history and legacy, and also reach that we have, but we do have restrictions. We do have things that we put for the right reasons that we put on ourselves, and we have to navigate those things. So that's my expertise lies on that, versus like specific issues that I'm helping another client dealing with, and then I can go kind of systems thinking on that level. I'm much more a fan on that one rather than a practitioner.
So the Polyplexus community is really made up of, I describe Polyplexus as researchers, funders, and policymakers. And one of the things that has come up in many of these conversations around applied systems thinking is how to keep, I find it in basic design thinking too, right? I think, I've put on many design thinking workshops, I'm sure you have, where you can have a really productive workshop. Mm-hmm. You can even have it, you can maybe make that a hackathon, or you can do all kinds of things. It's the keeping that practice, continuing to ask those questions, to run through the cycle of iteration and accountability and testing, right? Mm-hmm. Within organization or within the structure that you work in, do you have any insights to share on, there's the mind meld and the great coming together of diverse teams on a diverse topic that's super productive, and then things do constellate into projects or themes. What have you found to be effective to, right, once people start spending time and money, whether it's on project teams or software, they really don't so much want to come back to having that possibly disrupted or this has been my experience, right? Like they don't really want to hear that maybe we need to ask ourselves even again, are we asking the right questions? So yes. I'm curious if there's a mechanism, or is it folks like you who have that richness of perspective that pull that why back around, right? Is it the strength of personality, or is it internal process?
Oh yeah, I think the strength of personality is a huge driver, because it takes a unique way of thinking or mindset to encourage that, right? Mm-hmm. To defer judgment, to encourage behavior that is in some cases uncalled for, so to speak, because when you are in a certain government structures, the risk is a huge issue you worry about. Internal risk and external risk you worry about. And so when you start having crazy and wild ideas that might not be, the department's not accustomed to invoking nor doing, then you have this allergic reaction that comes from that. Like, oh, that's cool, that's cute that you're thinking about that, but that's not going to fly. But fortunately, from my perspective, our office is designed to poke those questions, right? To bring external ideas within the department to say, why not? Because it's easier to say, can we do that? And the answer to that is very binary. And in most cases, it's like, no. But when you start asking why not, mm-hmm. then you start finding out that the reason we didn't do it, not because it was illegal or it's out of sync or out of policy, it's just like it's too risky, or it's just not, we're not accustomed to that, and all those kind of things. Then the things, then we become the risk takers, then, because we have almost the license to experiment these things in a prudent way, not just in crazy, impractical type of risks, but calculated risks that are able to experiment on things that do that. But the cycles are important for us to continue to ask the right questions, both to us, to ourselves, essentially making ourselves become our own worst enemy within the building, right? Just like, why aren't you not doing that? Why not? Why not? That's important. But you do not want to go into an elusive quest of questions where there's no destination to that question, right? You do have to have a certain goal that you are trying to achieve, and you're asking the right questions from a place of humility and empathy, right? You're not just there to say,
the elusive humility and empathy.
yeah, and because it's critical to do that, because if you're just asking for the sake of asking questions, then you're just being a pest. You're just pestering to ask questions. But if you're trying to help that organization, because if you're having those conversations from our perspective, they're already coming to you because they have a problem trying to solve, right? They're saying, we can't do it on ourselves, especially in my line of business. They're basically saying, meaning the US government itself, is not able to solve this problem on our own. We need to solve it with others. So that itself, the first step, is rooted in humility, right? Just to say we are not able to solve this our problem. Then the second would be, then when we bring in others, then you do have to accept with that humility that comes with risk, because then you're now going into a universe you can't completely control. So that process itself is an uncomfortable when you start when at the process of asking questions, because the questions you ask have implications to the risk you're willing to take.
Right, sure.
Right. So I think that's, to me, is the kind of trained mindset that you need to have, is the freedom, the complete freedom, the oxygen. I always jokingly, I said the office that I want to, where we kind of manage within ourselves, is kind of the oxygen chamber for us to think freely, not to be contained by the obstacles we might face, but the opportunities that are in front of us. Because then we can create safeguards around the risks that come in to ensure that the department is not taking undue risks to get, to go into innovation or any type of things that might come in.
So do you think, I mean, you've been with the State Department for a while, and were you recruited because you had these traits and perspectives, or are these things that you recognized a need for, and within the institution that you were learning, and the effect you wanted to have, did you seek some of these skills explicitly to handle the job that you were growing into?
It's a great question, a very loaded question. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been now at State close to 11 years now. Yeah, I did get recruited, and it was from the work that I did. I spent 2 years at USAID doing kind of very experimental partnership ideas with the private sector, and so that repetition kind of preceded me when I left USAID, and then folks that I knew that I worked before came to me and said, the department is thinking about expanding this line of work. I think you would be great at this. And that's how I got recruited to come in. But most importantly, the traits that I had is to this date is I'm a very entrepreneurial in my mindset, meaning, I consider myself as an individual a startup on its own, still struggling to come up with ideas, to develop them, and all those kind of things. So I embrace the hustle of startups. And from a mindset perspective, and that mindset comes with agility, right? Tremendous. You have to have the resiliency, the agility, and the flexibility to be able to do that. Imagine applying that in a government.
I was going to say, and some imagination. Which one?
Yes, and imagine applying that to a bureaucracy who's
right.
not really accustomed to doing that. But I was fortunate enough for the people who came before me to say we need to have an office that thinks that way. Then for us to then build a team around it. Beyond my entire team structure is we bring in, birds of the same feather flock together, right? Like you're trying to bring in folks who could think in that way, not necessarily in the same way, right? We want diversity of thoughts and ideas and all those things, but they all have the same common denominator where they're always thinking that there is a solution out there. We're not the naysayers. We want, it's like, yes, we could do something. Yes, there are things we can approve. There are horizons outside that we can be thinking about that we bring into the table so they can help us reach new milestones. That is the kind of the key kind of the culture of our office, the office that you're trying to cultivate. If you want to have a systems thinking, a foresight driven, office culture, is that you have to create the oxygen chamber for people to think that way. Because if you don't do that, then you kind of proliferate this poverty of imagination, where people only think of their lane and nothing else. And then that's essentially the complete opposite of systems thinking, that everything happens because of where I am, nothing else matters. That obviously has limited outputs and limited type of impact that you can have. Since we don't live in a vacuum, we live in a very complicated society and universe and planet. You have to apply that way of thinking to every problem that you're trying to solve.
It begs the question for optimal productivity isn't exactly the word, but success for whatever the stated goal is of a particular institution.
Mhm.
How to assess the blend that is ideal of, I call myself an innovation catalyst because I sort of careen around in whatever environment I'm in to ask questions and to foster creative collisions.
Mhm.
Another way to call that is sort of that entrepreneurial can-do, rethink things within whatever environment. So within a bureaucracy, there's great, it's like the military, right? There's great efficiency in hierarchy and chain of command. And yet, what's the blend of not even maverick thinkers, just other thinkers, right? So you're the entrepreneurial traits that you bring to this, and I don't mean to even just focus it on you, but and there's no answer. It's just a learned sense of, well, not everybody could be that. And it obviously isn't good if everybody's siloed or bureaucratic, but we make bureaucracy a dirty word because so often it's such a slog. On the other hand, it's highly productive and stable. So it's just an open question to the research community of what's the blend? And when do those people who come in get crushed down into the bureaucratic mole, and when do they need to be moved or rotated, right? I don't have an answer. I'm not asking you a very direct question.
No, I think I know what you're trying to get at. I think to me, yes, you're right. The word bureaucracy gets a lot of bad rap in that sense. But to me, the equivalent of it is discipline. Because what I think one thing these type of departments, and especially the Department of State, brings is discipline to a practice of diplomacy. Discipline to how to not only conduct yourself, but how to conduct the act of representing America around the world. For you to bring discipline, you have to have kind of processes that adheres to that, right? It's an input-output process. If the input of doing that is ill-intentional or not well organized, then the output of your outreach becomes reflective of that. So you do have to have the discipline to know your stuff. That's the stuff you're working on, whether it's a specific bureau that you're sitting in on a functional perspective, or a region or a country that you're focused on. You have to bring depth of experience, depth of knowledge about that culture, about that situation, and all those kind of things. That discipline is what produces, that's what bureaucracies produce, because they bring discipline. So, the aggregation of knowledge and institutional systems becomes a byproduct of that process, right? But the entrepreneurial mindset you bring to the table is not necessarily to quote unquote disrupt that discipline. You're actually trying to expand that discipline by asking merely two-worded questions. You ask the questions, what if? What if, in the way we're approaching this issue, what if there is another way to do that? And that other way of doing that might not come within, right? That's the question of it comes without, meaning it's from outside. And that outside is not necessarily from outside. It is to this great nation that we represent. So you're not just looking to a different galaxy to look for it. You're saying, why don't we just look for it within America, where we have an amazing, America's superpower is it's what it offers. Its people and its companies, its brands, and all those kind of things. So you're essentially just merely kind of moving the lens a lot more wider, right? It's not like the amazing talented folks that are within the department. It's not lack of knowledge. It's essentially you're just opening the spectrum, right? Like there are all the other factors that you need to look at. There are other players within the tools that you have available. Like sometimes you're so jaded about what you do, you're only focusing on what can I do within the bureaucracy that I'm within the government structure that I'm in. Sometimes you don't even look at, are there other agencies that could be looking at those things? So you just ask the question, what if? What if we do it differently? What if we bring in other folks? And by asking that question, it's very expand. To me, those two words are the most imaginative and the most foresight way. Right? You're essentially almost opening up a gateway to the future. So if we think it this way, and might take us in multiple scenarios, we go look at it. So I think that is the key thing. The balance here is that to actually respect the discipline that institutions have built in, because they've built it for the right reasons to withstand all the stuff that happens around them. Then you bring in this kind of exciting element of asking the right questions, so that discipline could be strengthened, that discipline could be amplified, not necessarily be dismantled. And that's the way I view, at least my humble recognition, my humble contribution. When I say I'm broadly talking about the team structure that I have, is essentially that.
Fantastic. We have a question here from Gabriel. Hearkening back to your reference at the beginning, explaining public-private and the outreach beyond government to get things done. And he asked, what do you think drove the change from government leadership to business leadership?
Okay. So let me reframe that question, or let me correct Gabriel with that question. I think that the question is not necessarily business leadership. What we're saying is non-government leadership. Because that is a critical thing. So when I'm talking about private sector engagement, we're not just talking about businesses. We're talking about there's civil society groups, there is academia, there's diaspora groups, there are faith-based groups. I mean, essentially the list goes on, right? All these different actors they all are non-governmental, meaning they're not state actors, they're non-state actors. So with that definition, so if I take out the word business and just bring in private sector as broadly defined, what drives it is pure data. I've always, cite this data that shows that back in the early 70s, or in the data that US economic engagement around the world, 90% of it used to be government engagement, meaning official development assistance, meaning foreign aid. Now in 2020s, it's completely reversed. 90% of it is all private sector. All the actors that I just mentioned, less than 10% of it is the government. So when that paradigm shift is not, like I said, we just got up and said, no, we should be including other people. No, they're already included. They're already engaging. They're increasing their engagement. We're waking up to that fact and saying, then how do we then work together? So in a way that the engagement totally becomes an all-America approach, versus that's the government and that's the private sector. Because as far as the world is concerned, they view America as kind of one ecosystem. And how do we bring in an all ecosystem approach in doing that? So that's the reason why this mind shift, the paradigm shift that happened, is because the facts on the ground changed. The resources and their allocation and their distribution shifted, that where now private sector players are playing a very active role around the world. If you talk about foundations or companies and organizations, their hands and their approaches have been now expanded, and some of their reaches might be even greater than our reach. And so in that cases, that's the reason we do these things. It's not it's driven by data.
So just to take a little bit of a sidebar, in your practice, have you had much experience, or you have insights in partnerships, or this mosaic of players to include Indigenous communities?
Great
what
question.
have you learned from that in terms of the perspective of them as integral, not only integral to a system around issues or region and culture and respect, but one of the things that has been challenging in this series of salons is to bring into the Venn diagram of systems or holistic perspectives, spatial perspectives, has been the unique systems perspective of so many Indigenous cultures. And so I'm very curious, since you're explicitly dealing with that gathering.
Yeah.
What have you learned? How can we do that better?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So from, obviously most of the work that I've done, almost all of the work that I've done is overseas. And in that perspective, we always tend to design our thinking process and our program designs on ensuring that there's local intake, there's a local buy-in into it, right? Whether that local is indigenous or not is a secondary question, but it's very driven by that GPS coordinate we're trying to do. And I'll give you one example. We did a couple of years ago a hackathon. You mentioned hackathon as one tool to bring in, and we did a hackathon called Fish Hackathon, which was around the fishery and the kind of the unsustainable path that we're in, the world is in fishing to the ground, so to speak. And so we wanted to create a collaboration with others to see if technology could be a solution to that. And so we, using our embassies, we went out there and looked for, in some of these priority countries throughout Southeast Asia and in Africa, other places, we said, let's get problem statements rather than us saying, they should have these tools, that tools. Let's go to these small scale fisher communities in the world, and like, what are the and the ministries that govern them in terms of what are the problems that you're facing, and could those problem statements, can they be addressed by the systems thinking tools and resources that could be developed for them. So we did this hackathon, and we obviously collaborated. And another systems way of thinking is we did these hackathons at places you could probably guess is aquariums. And that is another dot connection. We asked the question, who cares about fishery?
Right.
That's us, right?
Right.
NOAA might care about it. Great. These Ministry of Fisheries might care about it. Who else? When you ask the question, like, ching, 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 aquariums care about this because their entire business model depends on the sustainable fisheries being around, right? If they're not around, there's no aquariums. So that's the kind of systems I think that you bring to but we actually culled these questions, these problem statements from around the world, from those indigenous communities that are saying these are our pain points that we're facing in managing our fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are technology solutions, not all of the problem statements of technology is going to address it. There might be other policy areas that they could deal with, but if there is technology we could deal with it, we will deal with that. So we did it 3 years in a row, from 3 or 4 years in a row. And it went from like a 5-city start of a 5 aquariums. By the last time we did it years ago, it was in 40-something cities around the world, where the entire and we invited purposely not just folks who could code, but systems thinkers, folks who are psychologists, historians, and agriculturists. So everybody who could actually add their 2 cents into this problem solving exercise were there. But it was all anchored about, could then that user community utilize it, right? You can come up with this fancy stuff, but if the disabling environment that they live in it does not allow them to have these tools being applied, then their entire exercise is moot, right? So you always try to start from an empathetic place to say, we're solving this problem to a place where these are the constraints that they face. So you start from the constraints, not necessarily for the kind of the abundance that you cannot assume abundance of opportunities. You look at the constraints that they face, and I'm bringing an abundance way of thinking to that constrained environment to solve it. And I think that's one example that I can cite in the sense of what we saw as we did that, we saw better results in terms of the type of tools that people came up with.
So, okay, let's talk about diplomacy, or your perspective on diplomacy. What has surprised you as a systems thinker when you look at how the actual business or practice of diplomacy is prepared and acted on?
Great question. And I think diplomacy as a practice is a very nuanced and complicated.
I would say it's
field, if you would say so. Yes.
I would really, in the art and science of systems thinking, I think it falls very heavily in the art.
Yeah.
But it is a unique art form. It is
Yes.
obviously an essential art form. And the reason it's, other than that it's just interesting that we want to discuss it, is what can the practice, the art of diplomacy as a systems process, how can we learn from that? How can that be applied to other things, right? What are the unique ways of looking at those complex systems
Yeah.
that diplomacy deals with, right? It's not an org chart, it's not a product chart for some tech company. It's life and death and geopolitics, right? Prestige, it's a whole lot of other factors, which are, I would argue, are things that institutions deal with, whether it's a university or whatever. And the stakes might be lower, but they have many of those same things. What are the schemas? What can we learn from a diplomatic practice that is useful elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is obviously the complexity of global affairs and how they emerge and how they come up. The other one is trying to be as dynamic as possible, especially, I mean, if you ask this question 20, 30 years ago, you probably get a different response than now, right? Because the pace of change and the velocity of information has grown so blindly fast, then you have to be dynamic enough to shift with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one thing that obviously that still stands true, is that you're making decisions. At the end of the day, our why is advancing American interests around the world, building these alliances and relationships to ensure that the American people and the American enterprise, the American values are advanced and adhered and around the world. And within that time frame, within that mindset, you're obviously then dealing with multiple factors that are external to ourselves, and sometimes even external beyond the sovereignty of countries, right? You know, when you're dealing with climate change, when you're dealing with the pandemic, who knows no border, right? When you think of diplomats, you think of them as folks who deal, country by country, bilateral, multilateral type of relation. But then when you're faced with these planet-wide type of issues, then diplomacy itself has to evolve, right? Then you start thinking about we is greater than I becomes a factor that you need to look at. And so we have shifted. Obviously, the department has been at the forefront of thinking through those things, even with the emergence of my office itself, is that realization that the sovereignty issue is no longer just about the borderline of a country. There are entities that have no flag, but they are much more influential in terms of where things go. And so that to me, that not just the systems thinking, but the dynamic thinking that comes with that is what I see it could be applicable to the private sector any way that you're looking at it. We as kind of practitioners of this discipline, you take the world in its complexity, and then you try to layer a certain level of policy decisions that you make on that complexity. Mm-hmm. And I think whoever deals, who are not in the diplomatic field or something looking at it, I don't think that is far from their line of thinking, right? If I'm a company, I'm thinking about engaging with your partners, whatever widgets that you're creating, you're viewing your either competition or your suppliers in the same way we look at kind of government. So there is, I would say, similarities into it, but vastly different in its impact and its magnitude and all those kind of things. But the way of thinking is still there, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with humans. It's all human-centric behavior, right? And I think that's, to me, is where I would rather focus on the common denominator of we are dealing with humanity, and in what drives it, what incentives are out there, what pulses that these decisions that we all make, and you want to make sure that you're creating a win-win situation where the decisions that you make can actually have a beneficial to the communities that you're engaging with, whether it's the fisheries example that I give you, the worm empowerment work that we do, or whatever policy imperatives that we're trying to advance. That at the end of the day, you're advancing American interests while advancing the welfare of obviously others in that sense.
How to map or discuss things that are soft power or or influence or factors that don't have metrics or are more challenging to create metrics around?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is not the office that I don't deal with. There is an entire office called ECA, our Educational Cultural Affairs Bureau, who run the Fulbright Fellowship and all these programs that you're now well known for. I mean, the depth of work that Bureau does for almost decades of cultivating relationships, creating exchanges between Americans and foreign entities coming to the US or vice versa, that is very difficult. You can quantify the number of people who come and go,
Right.
but it's hard to quantify the hearts and minds that you've been able to change because they've now spent a week in Kansas or in Arkansas or in Missouri or in Florida, whatever they might be. And now their entire mindset has been changed in terms of how they regard America and its people. That is, to me, is that when I hear about some of the stories that you hear, I mean, you hear now, I've heard stories of prime ministers who at one point were Fulbright scholars, who did their exchange programs in some cities, and they feel a certain sort of kinship and affinity to that place. So those are immeasurable. It's hard to measure them, but they have a huge impact in how we build our relationships with the world. And that way of thinking is what cultivates kind of the results that you get, the impact that you get comes with that type of thinking, not necessarily of a matrix of saying, I want results. Results are ripped in centuries, not necessarily in next year. You might help we have these African leaders, YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative that we do, bringing young Africans on a summer program in the US we've done for a couple of years. It's hard to, if you ask me what is the impact on it, they come to America and they look at all these things, they go to schools and all those things, but the results, you're probably going to see it in 20 years, 10, 20 years, when these young leaders become leaders. And then our relationships with our country becomes a lot easier because they understand our values, they understand where we come from, they understand our principles. So it's a lot easier to do those things. So there are programs. I'm citing that an example that comes to my forefront, but there are tons of other things that we do, the department does. And that's one of the biggest problems, the perception that we face is that people's perception of the department is very limited. They just, they think of visas and passports. I think that's it.
Or huge treaties. They don't think of all that.
Yeah, I mean, if they're thinking treaties, I'm surprised by that. Most of the perception that I hear is they're not thinking through those things. But there are amazing area of talent and expertise that the department deals with to the open sky agreements that lets you fly around the country, around the world. And I know there's space treaties that you and I talked about this. All these things are the byproduct of the department, and it's amazing staff that are negotiating and creating, essentially paving the way for the future, and in that systems thinking and that vastness element of those things.
So I'll throw something out here. I was thinking, I mean, I've drunk the Kool-Aid clearly around it, a systems approach at least being part of how to work on and look at complex problems. And but I feel like there's perils and opportunities in a systems approach. And so I'll just throw this out because it's been top of mind, and it's the growing conversation on undoing, reclaiming, pushing back on humanity's kind of terrible track record, productive but terrible track record of colonial expansion, right? So this word of decolonialism or decolonializing, and I'm very curious about where that friction comes in an institution clearly associated with the state in attempting to make partnerships, right? Are you coming up with or finding new language or asking new questions or asking them in a new way because of that growing sense of, wow, as a world, we have a lot of history and inherent systems that, caused a lot of harm.
Yeah, I mean, I think then I would use the word de-emphasizing in that sense, right? There is the virtue of what I was talking about in terms of the emergence of my office and practices of the work that we do, either at state or USAID, is de-emphasizing the overemphasis on governments
Okay.
to solve problems or to expand their horizons, right? That by recognizing that individuals, civil society groups, community groups, all those things that now have a say on how we solve the problem is, quote unquote, the decolonization process that you're talking about. But I prefer the word de-emphasizing that the role that the government is playing is now being not reevaluated, but rethinked in a way, right? And that can only happen when there is a proliferation of actors that are non-state actors who are bringing value-based collaboration solutions to the table, right? When you have private organizations or companies or startups or whoever they might be, to say we have a certain solutions for this climate change issue or the crisis, the energy crisis that you're feeling, or the water shortages that you're dealing with, or hunger, whatever the problem statement that X might be, solving for that X might be, that in itself, that entire movement is refreshingly new, right? So that itself now creates the new movement that takes you to the D whatever process that the world is going through its legacies of these institutions that we have, or some of the thought process that we're thinking about, including at the departments now. There's a lot of emphasis on, rightfully so, on diversity and inclusion, even from a diplomacy perspective. And President Biden and Secretary Blinken has put that emphasis greatly, and they've now recruited, I think for the first time, a chief diversity officer to the department who's thinking about those things. How do we make sure that systemic issues that are in the building, ensuring that the faces of America is well represented in the way we do these things around the world?
The State Department looks like America. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I feel passionate about that, obviously, for a person of color myself, seeing that shift happening, and seeing this in the next generation of officers who might be coming in, is a great thing in terms of bringing that new thinking, new way of approaches, and the de-emphasizing that happens, where the spectrum of talent that you get and the spectrum of organization tools that we deploy are truly democratized in that sense.
We have another question from Gabriel. So, where do you see the future of systems thinking? And will your observations on it be valid in decades to come? Will the methods and thinking from your office spread within the department, or within the big department?
It's a great question. I think the future of systems thinking is tied to the future of foresight. That's kind of a mouthful to say, and I think now I see there is a great deal of emphasis and almost a high demand. It's high time for folks who are focused on foresight and systems thinking, because the two most burning issues that we face as a society, one being the pandemic that we're still unfolding, and climate, has case in point proved that these problems are systemic wide problems, and how we solve them then demands that we need to expand our horizon in the way we think about these things. So to me, the future of systems thinking or foresight is being organically driven by the problem we faced, or the lack thereof of foresight that we had, right? In expecting the anticipation of the pandemic of the sort. People have been talking about a pandemic happening, but nothing much was done about it. Now, like, oh my God.
Case study.
Scenario. And so now it's like, oh man, now we need to take this seriously, because the disruption has been so dramatic. And in the case of climate, it could be even more dramatic. Then it's gonna lend itself. It's almost, what as they say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. This is, there is a crisis and opportunity that is coming in that. And then the system thinking community and the foresight community then have to then bring forward, that community has to bring their best foot forward by coming up with consumable way of thinking to this thing, right? Sometimes systems thinking overthinks.
Yep.
In the way of things these happen. And I love when you say arts and sciences, the arts element of it sometimes is missing, because the complexity of systems is very science driven. That you forget that to capture humanity, you have to have stories. You have to have certain elements to do that. So the arts do an amazing job in doing that. And so I think the emphasis in ensuring that the discipline of systems thinking and foresight have to be consumable to the average person. It cannot be an elitist sport. It has to be a highly democratized, because systems thinking says we need to democratize things, right? We need the way we think and all those things. Then the practice have to be democratized too, that anyone can actually be able to consume it. It shouldn't be where
as soon as you're stepping into the infographics or the diagramming or the expertise, there's a great love, as many of the researchers in this community can attest to, of the complexity and the pride of how complicated and difficult my perspective or my specialty is.
Yes, and I think this is where I see an interesting arranged marriage between the creative economy and the creative sector being able to be helpful to almost translate, right? In the practice of diplomacy, translation is an important thing. The language barrier that sometimes you face and how to do that. There is a kind of a language barrier between systems thinkers. Yes. And the kind of the masses that you're trying to impact, right? So to me, the translators are the creative people, the storytellers, the musicians, or the kind of broadly the creative. They need to be deployed to make sure that the world thinks in that manner.
So here's a question for you. How visual? What is the mode that? We've talked about mind maps and some of the sort of staple tools in classic Western systems thinking, systems dynamics, complexity science, design thinking. That there are some known, very established diagramming tools, mapping tools, but how much do you use those things outside of your team?
Yeah, great. There's one example I'll give you is friends of mine and I did this interesting project that we saw a problem. One of the problems that we were doing a lot, we as I mentioned, the startup world that I work a lot intimately with and I'm a huge fan of. One thing that you face from innovators was those who have kind of looked at these systems issues and then come up with a specific product or process to kind of put forward in the marketplace. I have this idea that can solve these grand, wicked challenges that they face. Is that they might be amazing kind of geeks and thought thinkers in terms of solving that problem, but they're not the best communicator. So we were. I was joking with friends of mine that when you hear pitches from startups and folks who have ideas, you're really not inspired by the thing. Like they drop these data on you and all these things that are awesome and impressive, but it's just not resonating with you. So we started this thing called Pitch and Flow, which essentially we married startups and their founders with hip hop artists.
Of course.
And we did this event 4 or 5 years ago at the Kennedy Center called Pitch and Flow, where we kind of created this collaboration between an MC, a rapper, and a startup founder. And essentially the MC became the spokesperson for that startup. And it was a sold out crowd at the Kennedy Center, where these MCs basically, competed. It was a rap battle of, you should check it out. It's pitchandflow.com is the website, and I'll write it down. But that was one use case that we used essentially to bring in a mass appeal. Hip hop has a huge, from a youth perspective. At the end of the day, the appeal that you want to have is not with the past. It's not my generation or yours. It is the next generation that you're trying to appeal to. And the language of the next generation, or at least at this, as we know it now, is hip hop has a huge following. And then how do you then, this is what I'm telling you, you go where the audience is, not necessarily you got to pull them to you. So then you said, if you want to show there are amazing innovations and systems thinking that are happening, then it needs to be consumable in a language and in a delivery that young people are accustomed to. And we saw that immediately with the pitch and flow, that you see people, I mean, I've never seen a pitch where people come out, dancing, going crazy. This is where people were just jazzed up, that hearing a story of a startup from an MC perspective ignites a different neurological response in that sense of what that means. So I'm just trying to demonstrate that storytelling.
I'm tracking with you, and it's good, because my bias, Laura's bias, is very much toward wanting to make a vocabulary and a comfort level with visual thinking, right? That how we sort of naturally think, or how our brains actually process information. But I think it's a piece, but I forget, and I tend to think of the storyfication and that piece as the marketing of things later, as opposed to at the more core level are the key takeaways. So if here's this complex Gordian knot of systems, what do I want? And I can map it, I can talk about it, I can turn layers on and off. What do I want your takeaways to be? Right? And I forget that things like the clarity, if you will, of music, of different ways of getting to it. It's just a good reminder.
It is. I used the hip hop as an example. There are multiple, art forms that you could use to do that. But that's, if you think of TED Talks, were very popular. Their format is amazing. It kind of captures imagining. Their slogan is ideas worth spreading, not ideas worth having, right? Because if you're just having an idea on your own and no one doesn't get traction, it doesn't go anywhere. You want to make sure that the ideas that you have, the products that you have, does go viral, does go spread, not just for the sake of yourself as a person of the idea, but for the sake of the world, so other people can build on that idea on top of yours. As we've already said, if the world is complicated, it's at the systems level are interconnected, then you're just a dot into this cosmos. So therefore, you want to make sure at least your little dot is spreading to a point where people can consume it. And I have never, at least in my personal opinion, I've never seen a pitch deck going crazy.
Going viral.
But I've heard songs going viral. I've heard videos going viral. So that's the point I was trying to make, is that we want to make sure, as from a systems thinking and foresight practitioners community perspective, the emphasis on the storytelling, the emphasis in communication has to be part of the design thinking element of it, not just an afterthought, like let's just build the real thing and we'll communicate it later. Because the way you communicate might actually influence the product or the solutions that you're trying to build to begin with.
So putting on your academic hat for a second, are there studies or resources that you have turned to or been exposed to that really have studied the dynamics of partnerships?
Interesting. There are a bunch of HBS, the Harvard Business SBR review, has a bunch of articles. I remember, and I can't think of straight up, but there are some case studies that they've done. They even did a case study about our office and why our office matters back during Secretary Clinton time. When I find it, I'll email it to you, but people could search for it. There are amazing kind of journals that have been written that is examining why collaborations happen, why partnerships happen, right? There's a great book actually by Morten Hansen. It's hold on, Morten Hansen. It's a kind of a leadership book, but it's emphasis on collaboration and partnership. So I would recommend that folks look at things like that. But frankly, the other thing is it's also it's a growing field. It's not highly researched, and that's, you asked me for the challenge for the kind of the academic or the thought the thinkers and who might be in the,
What do you wish you had data or advanced study on for knowing things and maybe looking at things freshly, but also for evangelizing within the world that you're in? What do you wish the research community was working on that you're not sure they are yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the empirical analysis of why partnerships happen. I think there's less empirical evidence. There are anecdotal and just theoretical things that we talk about. And I've seen it from a practitioner's perspective. I've seen it, why it happens and all those things, but I have not seen kind of deep dive, data-driven, analysis that shows why a partnership versus solo versus a partnership would matter, like a controlled experiment. That's as if an organization tackled a problem on their own, the result is X. But if they work by others, by working others, it's an X plus 10 or X, X times 10, whatever that might be. That we have accepted that to be God-given. Like, yes, of course, when you work with others, that happens. And I believe in it. I'm not suggesting that I second guess that, but we need to be a lot more empirical about it. I would love to see more research being done in that area. And there are evidences out there. There are projects that have been done that way. There are interventions that happen, but I don't think anyone, at least to my knowledge, that might have been out there and I have not come across to it. I think that there needs to be a lot more empirical analysis on that.
I think also in particular, when is it too many stakeholders? And
Yes.
it's paralysis.
Yes.
And do public-private partnerships really work? Like, what's the track record? That's one of the questions that we've been attempting to ask over these months is, again, I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I believe systems thinking works and is a valuable part of the arsenal, but what's the actual track record?
Yeah.
Has it saved the world?
It is, it's true. And I think that, but there's also a misunderstanding that the semantics in terms of what we call these things matter. Because when people think of PPPs, they think of infrastructure programs like toll roads.
So say what PPP is.
Public-private partnerships, like, people think of them like the toll roads that are here in my state of Virginia that I use, that I pay for, and all the, ports that are being built, airports that are being built. All those things are infrastructure projects that are the private sector collaborates to finance with the public sector to do these things. The work, and which are great, and they have. I mean, that's in its own a pillar of investments and opportunities that are out there that the government, states and federal governments utilize to essentially deploy a public good. And they finance public good by working with the private sector on that. But the other side of what PPP or collaborations, whatever you want to call them, are much more value-based, right? The last P, I always jokingly with people, is not procurement. You're not just saying the government pays a private sector to solve a problem. That's a procurement. I paid you to render a service. Right. It's not really a partnership. We're more talking about value-driven, or Michael Porter calls shared value-driven partnerships. So we're basically saying, we have a common problem that we're trying to solve, and you care about it, we care about it. Then how do we co-love, co-develop, co-take the risk in solving that? Those are the ones that are kind of emerging. So when you compare the two, even resource-wise and importance-wise, the infrastructure projects they tend to outshine or out loud the conversation about why is effective or not necessarily the value-driven type of collaborations that can emerge, not necessarily are not driven about financial transactions that happen between the private sector and the public sector. It's much more about value-driven. You have resources, you have know-how, how do we work together to solve it? Those are the ones I tend to work a lot more
on. What do you think our biggest risk is in this as we look ahead to a post-COVID world, and there's this small flexing but
Mhm.
pervasive flexing of a global and cross-border openness to look at both problems and potential solutions and collaborations. How are you filling that gap before sort of daily life takes back over? How are you taking advantage of that window to insert in the systems, that systems perspective in your niche?
A great question. I would say, I think one of the things the pandemic brought to the forefront to all of us is the humility that we need each other, right? That just the physical intimacy, not being able to travel and be able to break bread with people, and because every partnership starts with a dialogue, with a conversation, with a drink or whatever.
Hopefully,
And
hopefully a
the,
meal.
yes, or a meal, whatever that is. So, and it is, and not having that being disrupted, it also, what that means is that also disrupts collaboration, that disrupts solutions that might come out of it. So, however, technology, as I'm doing that now with you, has been able to at least partially been able to overcome that, right? At least the communication is not completely disrupted. We are still collaborating, we're still talking to each other. But some of the personal touches, the things that comes with by being in a same physical space might not be there. And I think that reminder, it used to be kind of an academic or an abstract concept when we talk about these things before, like we're not collaborating more on all those kind of things, but not that abstractness now is a lot more crystal clear why collaboration matters. Even if when you're looking at some of the solutions that are coming because of COVID-19, they are a byproduct of multiple companies coming together to solve it, because they realize if I'm working on my own, I will not be able to solve it. So there's a lot of lessons learned from that perspective. So what I'm excited about is this mental state of we is greater than I is no longer some kumbaya slogan. Like, I think people realize that humanity faces its common threats, be the pandemic or other issues. And I'm excited, hopefully, that new thinking can foster collaboration among governments and their respective private sector folks to do that. And I'm also, the other thing I'm in a hopeful way optimistic about is that we have some dynamic private sectors, not just American private sector, but overseas ones. They do not have the same level of collaboration mindset as we do with our private sector, right? Some governments look at their private sector as entities they regulate and tax, not necessarily they can collaborate with them to solve problems. My hope is that now this problem, that this pandemic has also maybe awakened or the policymakers to think about their private sector as a resource for ideas, resource for solutions, versus just like folks you just kind of have to regulate with. So those are the kind of things that I'm hopeful about, and the kind of the post-COVID environment that we're going to be as the world opens up and as the vaccine distribution becomes widespread, that we all come out of our cocoon and our shells with this zeal and energy that working together is no longer a luxury. It's no longer kind of a peripheral things. It's the core of the things that companies should be doing, governments should be doing, academic institutions should be doing. It's almost like our missions have to be shifted differently. The way when an organization puts out their statement, that statement has to be systems wide, not just about singularity, about their own things. I think that's my hope on that.
I'm really excited to see what happens. I feel like schools were forced to pivot and invest a ton of money into online education, many of them much sooner than was on the roadmap, but most of whom kind of had it on the roadmap. And now, because they've made that investment and they've learned how to do it, it's not completely even in all places, but there was a window of time when it was the major prestige universities who were offering online courses, and either for free or developing that into a business model. Now that everybody's had to figure it out, what does that mean for a very different global educational reach and therefore conversation?
Great question. We actually thought through this when the pandemic started hitting. My team we have this partnership with the academic institutions called Diplomacy Lab. We got 40-some universities under it, where it's an exchange of knowledge, where we put out questions, foreign policy questions, to a set of universities, and they bid for them. And if they get it, they basically, on a semester basis, faculty and students on a course would work on that challenge. Mm-hmm. So it's like there's no financial transactions, kind of a value-based type of collaborations. So we tapped into it. We went to these universities and said, hey, you're figuring it out, obviously, with the resources and all those things, but there are countries in Africa and some other emerging markets where that is not clearly an option. It's not something that how could we work with you to lend a hand to kind of your peers, so to speak. And the number of kind of positive overture that we got from the community, from the Diplomacy Lab community, we were just amazed how responsive that they were. Like anything they could do to help, it was amazing. And I think it's on part of the conversation we talked about is the MOOCs and all these kind of classes that are out there. People have been thinking about, is there really a problem in that? Is there already existing platforms that are already out there? Or are we just helping them connect to the grid? Is there a lack of grid, or is it just the last mile grid problem, right? And so what I see is again the democratization of education is every second is being accelerated by these type of platforms that are, whether it's the edX ones or Coursera, and there's tons of them that I'm not even, and there are even, those are the American brands that I know of, but there are even tons of them overseas. That is now allowing, whether you're in Bamako or you're in Guatemala City or whatever you are, you now have access to these type of educational systems. And another question is, are we creating what I call, it's almost a supply chain question from an education perspective. Yes, you can have access to that course, but are there value chains in that education that allows that individual not only to obtain that knowledge, but to apply it to a job, to apply it to a career? And then those are the kind of, this entire conversation about the future of work that people think about is intimately involved to the future of education, right? Because talent comes out of that educational system. And as that being democratized, and that's the other thing that we saw, is this work from home or remote work has proliferated tremendously. And does that now proliferation does that also no border? That does now companies now have the ability to hire a person in a completely different country with a different set of labor codes and the different type of expectations, taxation clauses, all those kind of stuff. So imagine the complexity of that, right? So democratization, as exciting as it might be, has huge complicated implications on how these systems work. And obviously I'm not dealing with that, but hopefully someone who knows about the stuff is dealing with it. But those are the kind of things that are happening. They're exciting to see these things proliferate, but they do have huge implications on the way we conduct ourselves. So the education field, the academic institutions are the engine of the future of work. And my hope is that those two are somehow interconnected, that we're producing for the future, not necessarily for the past.
I mean, obviously the tech sector globally has rushed in to work on business and technology around video conferencing and online coursework and secure online work. Have you personally, or your team, have you gotten to see some of the cutting edge? I deal on the experimental, experiential design side of some things of teleconferencing and almost holograms, or bringing folks in. I'm very curious about there's partnerships and the idea of us all believing that we're in the room together, not flat on a screen. The next level is being there. What will that do? Can you imagine? I mean, just imagining in diplomacy, right? When you can really be in a private meeting but you feel like you're there, not even like this.
Yes, that's true. I mean, I used to attend every year with CES, the one in Vegas, and I've seen some of those prototypes of the things, and seeing that, it gives you goosebumps to see what this can mean. But in connecting to the line of diplomacy, you do have to be sensitive to the cultural elements of what it means to do that, right? It's just technology, just because technology allows you doesn't necessarily mean your counterpart would appreciate what that is, right? And not necessarily of the appreciation of the technology, but the overture that comes with that, right? Because a lot of things gets lost in translation, so to speak, in these kind of things, right? So you're making sure that you're not pushing for technology for the sake of the technology, for its awesomeness or for the coolness. You're deploying technologies on the need basis where those things are acceptable on both sides. I always joke to people, collaborations and conversations they look awesome and beautiful when they look like they're tango. Like if you see tango dance, it's most mesmerizing when the two partners are just doing their thing. It's amazing. But you do not want that tango dance to turn into wrestling, where you're now not working in harmony. But in the same thing here in technology, you want to make sure that it's in harmony with the things we're trying to solve, that technology becomes an enabling tool, not necessarily the imposing tool with what you're trying to solve. So clearly the emerging technologies that are coming out, whether it's VR or whatever, augmented reality and some of the tools that they have available right now, they are exciting. And I think it's gonna, in some cases, it might actually solve the problem of travel. Like, and there are some cases that you could avoid travel if you're able to have those technologies. But there's going to be cases where that is really not going to be, that it's not the technology, it's not the barrier is not space.
Right.
The barrier is an insight and mindset, not necessarily the ability to just talk to people. So that would be my personal views on that.
Yeah, I daydream of the idea of that humans may be able, right? There's the advantages of big cities, unique thing that happens in innovation and culture in a dense environment, rich environment like that. But there's also perhaps for the planet, a solid percentage that if they could be part of the global economy and education, but not have to leave the land, who would rather live in a village or cluster of villages, a smaller community, and yet be fully engaged in the global economy, right? And so I like that. I daydream of, if I want to go have a meeting with those community elders, I can be invited to their space, right? Like I can hologram in and be in their environment that they're controlling, rather than me inviting them into a video suite.
Yeah, there was when I went to the Aspen Ideas Festival years ago as a scholar, and I remember there was a startup, an organization who set up these, I think they called them portals or something like that. They basically turned these metal containers, like shipping containers, into a portal where they have these technologies in them, and you walk into the portal, you never know who you're talking to. Another portal, and it could be in Africa or whatever. Live conversations.
I love it.
I thought that was awesome, because in a way that they place these, and the containers are so accessible because they're not some fancy office, whatever. They're just literally containers. They retrofit them for those things, and they kind of curate these conversations that they don't even have topics to them. Like, walk in, whoever is on the other side will talk to you, just have a conversation. And I thought it was cool. I thought I was like on a Star Trek, an episode in that sense. But seeing that creativity, I love these affordable, inclusive technology models versus the fancy stuff. Like when you take a VR type of technology and put it in a container that is anywhere, and then you make the conversation much more organic rather than anything else. So that popped my mind as you're talking about the daydreaming. That's a beautiful dream.
So I think I'd be remiss in not at least asking, and feel free to say you can answer, but to those listening who think they have a perspective or a value proposition or something to contribute to the mix around a partnership or around an area that should be considered for partnership, how does anybody contact your department?
Great question. Great question. Great question. My dog is
It's
barking
okay.
right now. I
Real,
apologize on
real
that.
life, working from
Real
home.
life, it is. It is. Yeah, I mean, I think we have a website. I'll put it on the chat shortly, but it's partnerships@state.gov is the email address. We are truly open for business, open for any ideas people might have, and we are powered by that. Our kind of steroid is that, where we love hearing from people, people who have ideas or thoughts that we maybe didn't think about. If there are problems that they are seeing around the world that are emerging that we're not seeing, let us know. Not only just telling us where you see the challenges, but what are the possible solutions that might come. We are a solutions generation platform, not necessarily a problem-solving problem, rather than just kind of identifying them on that level. So I would highly encourage all your members or the folks who are in the community to look at the Department of State as a resource, not just as a collaboration perspective, but also just brainstorming with us. And we post things when we have new challenges or new things that we're looking at, like we had for COVID-19 about almost a year ago, last summer. We had about $10 million we've secured that we wanted to put it out there. And we put out a call for people who had ideas on solving, and not necessarily the medical or the health issue, but we are already foreseeing. And the foresight, we're saying, okay, the pandemic will somehow, I mean, we have a huge promise and confidence in humanity that we will tackle it. This is before the vaccines were coming out. It was like, yeah, it will be solved. But once it's solved, what are the next generation of business models that would create resiliency and economic recovery for society? And where does that look like? So we had like hundreds of ideas that were, that were submitted, and we're now about funding 5 of them or something like that. So not only we have, ideas we're looking for, in some cases, we also have sometimes funding that might be available for people to bring to our attention. So check out our website, email us, and I'll send the link right now as we speak, so I don't forget it.
Partnerships@state.gov.
Yep.
Which part of the website?
I just now linked it there. That's the website. I hope I did not misspell it, but
yeah.
And the email address is partnerships.
Fantastic. Let's see.
So yeah, please, look us up, and love to hear from you all.
Well, there'll be some good ideas from this community, and some real richness, some deep thinking and resources, I believe. Well, Thomas, this has been absolutely a joy for me. I've been trying to get you in this seat for months.
No, it's my pleasure.
Thank you for your wealth of experience and your humility. It's really inspiring. As a citizen, I got to say, it's gratifying to know that there's a place for a practice and minds like yours within institutions that it's too easy to just write off as bureaucracies, right?
Thank you.
Deeply exciting on a citizen level. Anyway, with much gratitude, my friend, and yes, we'll talk soon.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.